We're going to be taking a close look at this Ecuador Sidra coffee. I've got some greens right here, and we're going to take a look at three really important attributes that are going to help us understand this coffee. The first one is density. I talk about density all the time here when I'm roasting coffee and I'm talking to you. It's really important because density has a direct impact on really our charge temperature, how much energy we can apply to the bean right up front without the fear of roasting defects, and more importantly, the way that heat transfers through the bean is different with a high density bean than it would be a low density bean. That means your approach when you roast the coffee should be different. The profile should be different because the bean is different and you're at a higher risk for roasting defects. You're going to need to slow down a little bit, which means your total roast time is more than likely going to lengthen. All right, so let's talk about this. I have this Ecuador Sidra coffee and I want to figure out the density. So what do? Well, I did a video on how to measure density, but we're going to do it right here. This is the Sidra coffee, and this is an Ethiopian Yirgacheffe. These two coffees are completely different. They're different varietals of coffee. This is a Sidra and this is a Typica. It's coffee, but it is from a different line in the family tree. They're cousins, I guess, is the best way to say it. Just like apples, you have different varietals of apples. They have different characteristics. The same thing is going on here with these coffee seeds. So this Sidra coffee is something that we're going to measure right now, and we're going to do the density test. You can see that I've got a line here on this cup. I weighed this cup with water in it, and it was 250 grams filled up to where this line is. So I've made this cup so that I can fill coffee up, green coffee up to this line and weigh it and multiply it by 4, and that will give me my density weight. So here we go. We're going to tare the scale. This is the Sidra coffee, and we're going to pour this into this cup pretty close to the line. There's a few beans that I've got to take out. I'll do that. Just a light shake, and that's pretty close. We'll go ahead and set that on the scale. 182 grams times 4 is 728. So 728 is our density score for this coffee. So is 728 high density? Yeah, it's pretty high density. When you have a score of 500, that's really low density. That would be like a monsoon Malabar. If you have something like 800, that'd be like a really high altitude Ethiopian. So now we're going to use an electronic meter to actually measure this. This is made by DiFluid. This is it's a digital measuring device for agricultural products, even like whole cherries, coffee cherries, it'll measure. But we're going to do this here. I'm going to turn this on. We're going to measure the density for this coffee, this Ecuador Sidra. And we're going to pour this. Normally you would do this outside of the measuring device itself. And you just want it to be nice and flat. That feels really nice and flat. We haven't compressed it, and we're just going to let the meter do its work. So measurement, moisture, and density is what we're going to test. And we're just going to focus on density right now, and that is 750 for density. Now we measured 728. So this is more accurate than measuring with a line, but it still gives you a pretty good idea of where you're at as far as density goes. So how would I treat this coffee differently when I roast it? Well, if I've been roasting most of my coffee on with a density that is around 600, then this coffee can take more heat. So I might consider using a slightly higher charge temperature. Next is moisture. Moisture is another factor within the green agricultural product that's going to influence what happens inside of your roaster. Whether you're roasting on a small air roaster, a fluid bed roaster, or a drum roaster, whether it's gas or electric, it makes no difference. The process is basically the same. Moisture is evaporating from the seed. This is part of the coffee roasting process. So what is the big deal about moisture evaporating? Well, the roasting environment tends to get moist. It tends to get humid. And there's a potential for very moist coffee to let out more humidity. So early in the roast, you may have moisture sweating the bean. That's actually going to cause less heat transfer during the roasting process. Water is just another barrier for heat to have to transfer in through the seed. So whether it's on the outside of the bean or inside of the bean, the more moisture there is in the bean, the harder it's going to take for that heat to penetrate through the bean. Also, you don't want to have a really humid roasting environment while you're roasting. And if you're pushing the coffee too hard with heat, you may have issues where you have an uneven roast. You may have blotching. And the best way to avoid that is by making changes to your air. So you're going to be introducing maybe a little bit more air with coffee that has a higher moisture level. And that airflow earlier in the roast is going to help move that moisture out of the roasting chamber. If I don't have a meter, how do we measure moisture level? That's the question. So I'm going to show you a couple things about the bean, and we'll talk about that for a little bit, just to give you some general ideas that might help you categorize whether this bean is a low moisture or a high moisture bean. We've got a pretty good representation here of these coffee seeds. So you can see the seed on the left is the Sidra. Generally speaking, when you compare the size of these two beans and the color of these two beans, you should be able to see a difference. The colors are fairly close. A moisture bean tends to feel a little more waxy, and this is a Yirgacheffe. This seems to be a little darker in color, a little darker green. Maybe this has got more moisture in it. It's not easy to tell. This is not an easy thing to tell, not all the time. Sometimes it can be kind of easy. You can see a clear color difference. These two tend to be a little closer to each other. So, as far as moisture goes, moisture can be anywhere from 9% to 12%. And we're going to take a look at these. These don't seem like they're super moist, and they don't seem like they're super dry. They just seem like they're maybe, like a middle of the road moisture. We're going to go ahead and pour this Sidra coffee back in like we had it. This is the exact same amount of coffee, so I just need to kind of smooth it out. I'm not pushing it down. And there, okay. Here we go. Measurement. And here we go. We're going to see a moisture of 10. So that is not dry and it is not moist, but it's basically average. All right, next is size. When coffee is being processed and they remove the seed from the cherry, they wash the coffee or they lie it out to dry in the seed. Whatever the process is they're doing, ultimately the seed does come out of the cherry and it is dried and it goes through a sorter. So basically imagine like a chicken wire screen with different sizes, right? This larger seed here is not going to fit through a small screen. So the coffee industry uses screen sizes to measure the different size coffee beans so that there is a fairly consistent range of coffee seed in the batch that they sell the importer and the people that are buying the coffee. So the screen size is seen here. So now you can see the Sidra is a larger bean and it's pretty significant in size compared to the Ethiopian bean. What that means is that there is more meat on the bone, so to speak, as far as trying to move heat through a larger seed. It's going to take more time or more energy to get to the center. But more importantly, if you're looking to have an even roast, it's going to take more time to get to the center. So with a larger bean, you might have to roast a little slower than this really small seed over here, this Ethiopian seed. So this will roast a lot quicker. The heat will get to the center of the bean quicker than this seed will. These are all things that we need to consider when we put our profile together. So bean size is the third factor in all of this, right? So we've got density, we've got moisture, and we've got bean size. Coming back to the DiFluid Omix meter, we can see we have a density of 750, we have a moisture of 10, and we have a screen size between 17 and 19. Now, when we measure the Yirgacheffe, and we're going to do that right now, we're going to see a big difference in screen size. So I'm going to just pour this out, and then I'm going to go ahead and put the Yirgacheffe bean in here, and we're going to take a look at the difference between these two coffees. Here we go, measurement. The Yirgacheffe is 784. So this is a higher density, 10.6%. This is a little bit more moist. And look at the screen size, 13 to 15. So each bean is going to roast differently, right? Because each bean is different. The Sidra coffee is different than the Ethiopian coffee. I think the biggest factor is size. I think that is one of the bigger factors that are going to cause me to approach this coffee differently than maybe a smaller bean that I would normally roast. I love smaller, high altitude beans like the Ethiopian Yirgacheffe coffee seeds. Some of the Central Americans that I roast have some pretty small seeds as well, and they're pretty dense too. So what am I going to do? Well, there's one other factor that we haven't talked about that does play a role in what's going on here. And I want to talk to you about that because this is something that many of us don't consider. This machine here has a 200 gram capacity. I've been roasting 180 grams of a smaller seed in this roaster. And it's a pretty, 200 grams is the capacity. It's not, you're not going to put much more inside of that roasting chamber. So what happens when we roast coffee is the seed structure expands, it gets bigger. So that volume that, let's see, if it's a 200 gram roaster, it's basically 90%. When I roast 180 grams, that's a 90% capacity that I'm applying to this roasting chamber. Then the beans get larger. By the end of the roast, I'm pretty much in a full 100% capacity for this. And how do I know that? Well, this will actually measure the density and the size of the roasted bean. Let's do that now. One of the challenges I've been having, this is the problem that I've been experiencing with this coffee, is the inside is much lighter than the outside because that heat penetration going into the seed it's too quick. I need to slow the roast down, so I need to use a lower charge temperature. I was applying a lot of heat because of the size of the bean, but I didn't take into consideration the capacity of this roaster, and I was roasting 180 grams. So there were a lot of things that I needed to adjust in this. One, I'm going to be using a smaller batch size. And then two, I am going to be slowing the roast down just a little bit, and hopefully that'll give me a more even roast and a more even heat penetration through the bean. Okay, so this is ready to go. We're going to do a moisture and density test on roasted coffee. And here we go. Now the density, instead of being 728, I think it was, It is now 442 density. That really doesn't mean anything to us right now because we don't have anything to compare it to. But when you start to track this and you start to track the moisture level in the bean, you can see how much moisture has left. It was 9.9% or 10% moisture, and now it's 1.8% moisture left in the seed. And this, again, is a light roast. We'll do the roast level here in a second. But look at the screen size. The screen size here is 23 to 25. Well, it was 17 to 19, and here we have 23 to 25. The seed has gotten much bigger. This seed has gotten quite a bit bigger, expanding because of the roasting process. And it just, it was just packed in this roaster. So that's just a heads up, something I think you might find helpful. Now we're going to do roast level. So this is showing it as a light roast. Now, when I grind the coffee, I use a different tray. So this is B. I'm going to use one that's even more shallow, and it's going to be a very fine grind that lays in here, and the meter will measure that, and it's going to say extremely light. So we'll crack open a seed here. So that is a lighter shade than this. It's darker on the outside than it is on the inside. So that's the difference. That's the problem, and that's what roasting coffee evenly, that's what we're talking about when we call that out. So taking a close look at these beans, it says light roast, but when you crack these open, it's lighter on the inside. And the reason for that is because I had a shorter development time. The roast was a little faster than I would normally have roasted, so the heat didn't have enough time to penetrate through into the center of the bean. And the bean, as soon as first crack happens, then there's less resistance for heat to reach the center of the bean, but I just didn't give it enough time. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what I shared today regarding density, moisture, and size, and also the capacity issue. All of these factors and how those might influence a profile that you've been trying to roast, or maybe some things you didn't know before about how each of these different attributes can affect how you roast coffee. Maybe you're roasting coffee with the same profile. We're going to be talking more about how you and I can apply these facts, this information about our coffee seeds, and apply them to a profile that we prepare. So we'll be talking about that in the future as well. But again, I'd love to hear your comments, share your thoughts, and I really appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a great week roasting. We'll see you next time.